Welcome, everybody. My name is Graham Wolf. I'm a junior at the University of Notre Dame, majoring in business analytics with a minor in the Hesburgh program in public service. And welcome to the New AI Projects podcast. Today, we'll be interviewing Jen Hall, managing director at Accenture, and also Notre Dame graduate, double majored in history and finance. And her focus is on innovation in culture, as well as the workforce of the future. And we're really excited to have her on for a wide-reaching conversation about how the corporate world is adapting to this new variable of AI. Jen, anything I missed in that intro there?
No, thanks a lot, Graham. The only thing I'd mention is that all the views I'll be sharing here today are mine, and I'm not representing the views of Accenture or my client today.
Understood. Yeah. Thank you again for being on. And for those listeners who are new to the program, we are the New AI Project. We're a research collective housed within the Technology and Digital Studies program at the University of Notre Dame. And our mission is to share the journey of learning about how AI is going to impact many different facets of our lives. We've kind of segmented this project into 6 different key domains with different student experts assigned to each one, between Tech Titans, which is focused on the major tech players, to Taming AI, which is focused on regulation, to AI at Work, which is the columnists we have here today. There's really something for everybody, and we encourage our listeners to go check out the New AI Project on LinkedIn after this podcast. Also with us today are 2 of those aforementioned student experts, Annie Zhao and Ella Tergiani, and we're really excited to have them on. And I'll pass it over to you guys to do a quick introduction. Annie, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, I'm Annie. I'm a senior here at Notre Dame right now. I'm majoring in computer science and economics, and I also have a minor in Chinese.
I'm Ella. I'm a sophomore. I'm the same as Annie. I'm majoring in computer science and economics, and I don't have a minor right now, but that's it.
Yeah, we encourage you to pick up computing and digital technologies. That's the plug for that minor. But
Consider.
But they've done some really great work recently looking at some of the trade-offs between creativity and efficiency as that kind of emerges in the corporate world as more and more implementations of AI products take place. So yeah, done some great work on that, and really excited to have them here as well. The first thing we'll kind of kick this conversation off with is an open-ended question to you, Jen. I'm curious, where do you see AI coming up in your work? And really broadly, how do you talk to clients about it? What do you tell them? What do they care about? When does it come up?
Good question. I first want to comment, I love that all 3 of you have majors that balance kind of the technology point of view and the liberal arts point of view. Obviously, I'm biased because I had that as well, but I think learning to think in those 2 ways is something really critical, and we'll come into the conversation here as we really think about the skills you're going to need in the future and where and when we think that generative AI and those technologies that are associated with it will be affecting how people do work, where they do work, and when they do work in the future. Also, generative AI really came up a lot last year. People will say AI, and I think in this conversation here, we're talking about generative AI. Obviously, automation and artificial intelligence is already kind of de facto. We're doing this regularly. You saw robotic powered automation happening a lot with kind of ongoing kind of billing cycles, things like that. So AI has been in use in a lot of corporations for several years. What's new about generative AI is the capabilities that it shows. So when we first were really talking to clients about this last year, we were really framing it as an evolution, like not a magic wand. Clients were cautious, or they're curious, but they were cautious. And especially for some of our clients in the public sector, very cautious, because obviously there's ramifications when you're serving your constituents, that you don't want to be too overly aggressive with something where you really weren't sure what would happen. So we are really emphasizing understanding before implementation and thinking about real business needs, not just like trying to have a headline and having something be out there now. A year in, and how things, how the conversation has shifted is that we're really moving from what is it to how do we scale this, and how do we scale it responsibly. That responsible AI is definitely a trend we're seeing a lot of. And we talked about it less as a tool and more as a partner. Like kind of, you probably have seen it the way you might have interacted with ChatGPT or Claude or, and some of the other kind of common platforms that you might be accessing generative AI with, is you use it as almost like you're having a conversation with it. So it's more of that can augment existing work, but also to challenge your mindset, especially if you prompt it to do so, and prompt it to ask you questions, and prompt it, say, I want to think differently about this. What am I missing here? What am I considering? So really where we're focusing now with clients is on trust. Trust is one of the most critical things that I think is it is going to become even more of a trend over the next 6 to 18 months. Those frameworks that surround it, kind of like the trust frameworks and the governance that's associated with it, and workforce readiness, the readiness to consume it. And that's, even as much as people focus on models, small language model, large language model, data, you have to have your workforce ready to use it and use it in the right way before you can unlock the power of generative AI.
Yeah, that's all really interesting. I'm hearing a lot about, like you said, the trust, the kind of permission to go forward with this new variable. It's a very kind of rhetorical conversation, rhetorical balance.
Yeah.
Getting the wording right, getting people on the same page. And it's interesting just to see that playing out in the news cycle that we're keeping up with as writers, but also kind of behind that black box from position like yours at Accenture, where you're actually talking to the folks who are uptaking these new products and implementing them. Sounds like cautiously and responsibly. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
So certainly some people have raised, including our writers, have raised some concerns about AI contributing to what could be called intellectual outsourcing or reskilling as opposed to upskilling, where convenience might start to erode critical thinking and creativity might start to fall by the wayside in favor of efficiency. I'll start off passing this over to Ella, who just published a great piece last week. It was about this exact sort of trade-off. Feel free to let us know your thoughts on that, Ella, and then we can pass it back to Jen and sort of see how that might be playing out in the real world. But Ella, take it away. Let us know what you found in your research about that kind of trade-off.
Yeah, perfect. So yeah, last week we wrote an article basically about the creativity trade-off. And it's interesting you bring up the teammate versus tool, because that was a big part of the article, is sort of how can companies teach their employees to think of AI as a teammate as opposed to something that you send your work and it sort of just feeds it back to you. Like you need that interaction to maintain critical thinking. And so I think that's really interesting. But in the article too, we talked about how even when you view AI as a teammate, you should not defer to it as like a smarter coworker. You shouldn't think of it as something that's better than you, because you need to have that interaction and, have confidence in yourself. And sort of that is where the article went, where there were certain studies, I think it was from Microsoft, and they sort of said that people who are confident in their own abilities are able to use AI in a more efficient and positive way, because they aren't treating it as something smarter. So they're taking those outputs and they're rereading them and they're interacting with them more than just accepting them for face value. And so I think that's an important distinction too, because that's sort of where the creativity and the critical thinking may falter, is when people begin to just copy and paste the output as opposed to saying, AI can get things wrong, or maybe my way is better for this current situation than the output that AI is producing. So I think it's about that interaction and not like an over-reliance that really will help people and innovation sort of flourish.
I think I agree with everything you said. And it was a well-written, well-researched article too. So I learned from it too, which I appreciated. I definitely think AI can diminish some of the strategic or the creative capabilities that people have if it's used as a crutch instead of a catalyst. And so I think what you're saying about the ways of working and the confidence of the worker is very important. And we've seen teams outsource drafts to Gen AI and then not even think about it. And I've been on the receiving end of emails from people where it's so clearly written by a chat GPT or something that you're like, you didn't even think about this. It's one point, it's not even making sense. Strategic thinking doesn't really begin with the output. It starts with questioning. And that's really kind of like at the beginning of the process. When used, what I think generative AI can do really well is to spark curiosity, help you break through a mental block, especially Brene Brown, and then you may have to go look this up for yourself, but she used to call it the SFD, the blank first draft, where you'd get just stuck by a blank piece of paper. It'd be hard to get started. Generative AI can really help you kind of start from that initial catalyst of giving you something to start from. And then it gives you time to think back more deeply, but only if you hold yourself accountable to using that time more deeply. If you just use generative AI to knock out a bunch of tasks and then you take on more tasks and you're not setting aside that time to think strategically or be like, okay, now I'm going to really consider what I've done this research on or these questions I've asked and now I'm going to go do something. And so that's where the trust and the critical thinking really comes in. AI can only go so far. It's our human judgment about when to use it, the questions we're going to ask, the things that we're going to discard that builds value. And then I'd say the other is that you really have to be thoughtful and understanding of what your language model is, information it's sourcing, and where it was trained. So if you're using the entire corpus of the internet, imagine everything it's trained on. What we're seeing a lot of like clients move to, especially for when they're in corporate use, is a small language model that learns on their own kind of ecosystem within our organization. So you're learning from that. So again, but you have to be thoughtful. It's like when you use those small language models, it is missing some pieces of information. So you always have to know where you're starting from and take that into account. And that's where the creativity and the curiosity, kind of what we call the human at the helm, really kind of takes place.
Yeah, that's very
Oh,
interesting.
I have a question about, from the consulting firm's point of view, since you are in a role that's probably, more client facing compared to a lot of, new graduates, just entry-level employees, they're probably the ones, in my experience, having intern, I guess, in consulting before, the ones using the new AI tools and, using them either as a toolmate or trusting it too much, however you want to put it. If they're doing that, but then, they're not necessarily the ones presenting the information, do you think that there's almost like a new filter that has to be gone through between maybe their work and then you or someone who's going to be, facing with the client to kind of discern like whether or not this is, too general of an answer, too AI, or has this, gone through the critical thinking skills? Do you feel like you yourself are now somewhat of a filter?
That's a great question. I hadn't thought about it. I immediately, when you started talking, started thinking about I need to go check in with my team on this, because I do have on my team, I have a woman who went to Cal and she interned with us for 2 years, and she's 6 months into her role, and she does do a lot of kind of the frontline work, initial drafts, things like that. What I've seen kind of in how we work, and I don't know that I was intentional about it as you were just suggesting, and that made me think I do need to be more intentional about it. We have conversations and like on all of our discussions, we're not like looking at a PowerPoint or kind of we have, I'd say it's almost more like a seminar type discussions when we're thinking about how we should be talking to a client, what information we want to bring them, what we think is going to resonate. And then she goes and creates a draft from that. So I guess de facto, we've kind of been having those conversations ahead of time. And she may use generative AI to put those together. I think for the most part, she's usually using the design tools to kind of shape them. But the content and what our point of view is, we develop in a conversation. And we'll, like right now, we're working with another client and developing their new operating model, one that we want to have take into account like a formal strategy and innovation role. And we're talking about who else is doing this? How are we getting that? We'll have information, we'll come back and we'll talk about it and then ask questions, and she'll go and research. So that's kind of how we're approaching it, which might get to, I think, the hypothesis you're putting out there about kind of making sure you have those guardrails that are shaping the conversation. But the intentionality of that, I really liked a lot. I love her
I guess
chat.
a follow-up question I have is, you know, I think a lot of consulting firms are now, using AI, generative AI too, for clients' projects. Do you feel like,
Mhm.
or have you seen some sort of trend where the clients are more skeptical in your recommendations, or they need you to kind of prove your critical thinking, your solution a bit more because they're, concerned that it was used with AI? I don't really have any data to support that. It's kind of a, I guess.
First, we always disclose if we've used generative AI at any point in the process. So we might say this was informed by generative AI, or this was partially written by generative AI, or we use generative AI to do research. So you have full disclosure. I think that gets back to the trust, is we're not trying to pretend that this is done without any generative AI assistance. Now, this is what I'll go, is that the trust part is so critical, is for most of our clients for whom we're doing this work are ones where we have a really strong trusted relationship. So I think that their perspective on kind of our value and our ability to bring in thought leadership and the work we're doing was kind of pre-generative AI. And so the trust factor is there. For new clients, I think that you this is where I think trust will really come in and play, is that you have to be fully transparent on where you're using generative AI in your process and in your research. And you should disclose what models you're using. You should disclose like how and where you used it within the work products so that your clients know. Because if you don't disclose it, you're going to erode the trust there.
Thank you.
I sort of add one too. Do you think that when you use generative AI, a client expects you to do things faster or have more content, produce better solutions in a quicker timeline?
Let's hope there's not more content. I mean, it's the proliferation of like things are, I think that's actually like a deterrent to Gen AI because there's so much out there, so many choices and so much information. It's like discerning that. If anything, I think they're looking for us to have a point of view and to come in like having done the research to know what you're talking about. And I haven't like where we're seeing productivity gains tends to be more in like the technology side on building code and being able to do that faster. I know, is it GitHub, the computer science people
Yeah.
use? Yeah. Unless on the technology side of that, I learned to code in COBOL. Fun fact, I actually might become relevant again when all the COBOL engineers retire. I'll actually have done it. But now, a lot of the basic coding or the testing, the things that were really time consuming, we're seeing clients get like a pretty significant reduction in how long that used to take, kind of the standard ways of working. So yes, and that for sure. On the more strategic side, again, I think it's someone that you can trust on the point of view and having taken the time to discern that and evaluate it and be thoughtful about the perspective that you're bringing to them, that they're not necessarily looking for that to be faster, but they are looking for it to be really good and well thought out because those tools are available.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, that all makes sense. I'm hearing a lot about, transparency, and establishing trust and maintaining trust. Here's where I'll kind of bring in a little bit of the student perspective. I think what we're seeing a lot of is professors, even other students, the people we're submitting work to, seeing any use of generative AI as undermining the process. And of course, I
Yeah.
mean, education is an entirely different, landscape, but it's hard to kind of shake that background
100%.
that we've kind of all internalized as students. So it's the thought of, putting this was partially, done by generative AI on something that I'm submitting. It's just, it feels a little bit,
Right.
it's hard to imagine, it's hard to imagine some, maintaining credibility through that. It sounds like transparency really is one of the keys there, and to making sure it's not something that undermines the
Right.
purpose of the work.
I do think that, and again, this is my point of view, I do think you all should be using generative AI in your coursework. Do I think it should be done in everything, like in entry-level classes? No, I can see a case where they're like, we want to make sure that Graham understands the fundamentals of how to do this. After that, though, I mean, this is the real world. You're going to be using it. How would you, if you're there to help prepare students for where they're going next, why on earth would you ignore one of the most transformative technologies of all time? I think what you actually should see is professors evolving to incorporate generative AI in their coursework. And I've seen this at some other universities where they're kind of going back almost to the Socratic method of where you share like an oral discussion of what you've learned and you can prove that you can talk about it and then you can write to it and you can discuss it and that you've internalized it. I mean, that more so than like for you to write a 30-page paper showing what you knew that could possibly be informed by generative AI versus if you're going to have a 45-minute conversation with your, kind of seminar class and you need to show what you know and you need to be able to answer questions, that's an entirely different kind of preparation and learning. I think there should be an evolution towards incorporating more of that. And once you've proved you have the grasp of the subject matter expert, it's kind of teaching you to fish from there on out and teaching you the discernment on what tools to use and how to use them and the questions to ask and kind of the having a good grasp of responsible uses of AI and how to kind of self-regulate that.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Yeah. I mean, there are ways of adapting to this new variable. Some of them just, I think take a little bit more of a risk. Some of them take a little bit
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
trust and bravery kind of to be the first mover and jump out there and do these things.
I
Some
think you just
professors, some companies, some universities are on the back end of that, and that's, that's natural. So yeah.
I think if you go to like kind of a classic design thinking method is you go to what's the outcome you want? What's the outcome you want from your student who's graduating? What's the outcome you want at the end of a class? And you think through that. Now, the ways that you achieved that 2 years ago, maybe now it's time to rethink how you do some of those. at least considering it. And I think just shutting off completely till they're not going to blanket use AI at all, generative AI at all. Again, going to like the real world outcome, if you want to prepare the students to be, capable in entering the workforce or, kind of like advanced society with being able to contribute, why would you not have them learn how to use this? And that's, it's like, it's, I think it's almost like kind of rethinking the entire, this technology is here to stay. All right. it's look at like what we've seen in the industrial revolution. I mean, and how people, transportation, making clothes, things like that. People had to evolve, and that's I think that we need to be considering this too.
Yeah, totally. You can really put it into broad historical terms like that. Is this another inflection point, the same way that the internet
Mhm.
was, the same way that the, industrial revolution was, that the car was. But there, it's still in its infancy. And in that regard, it's hard to be conclusive about, oh, this is just another, thing we have to treat like the internet or to treat, like any other innovation of the past. But yeah, it's certainly, it's an important perspective, one that a lot of people, kind of aren't exposed to, that this might as well just be the next, big thing we all have to adapt to. I do want to just recenter things real quickly and bounce off what we're talking about from the student perspective and preparing for the next stage. Another thing that, of course, comes to mind as a student, not only do you have anxiety about turning in things that are, even touched by ChatGPT, but also, about the job search process and the hiring
Mhm.
process and the discernment process.
Yeah.
Amid all of these changes to student workflows and corporate workflows, there's been a historically competitive and weak hiring market for the past couple of years in a lot of cases. And a lot of people have that kind of background anxiety, whether they're currently employed about being let go because of efficiency reasons, or whether they're searching for a job, not being able to find one because of their job being automated away, or whatever that idea is rooted in. How have you seen this play out, whether it's the anxiety or the actual outcomes? How have you seen that play out as somebody who might be involved in those kinds of decisions?
One is that, I think that the most critical skill of the future is going to be maintaining relevancy
Mm.
and being relevant and understanding and applying emerging technologies. So I think your generation actually going to be kind of well positioned as you enter the workforce to really having grown up as digital natives, to being really familiar with technology and understanding how it can translate those benefits to the workforce, and things that are not necessarily going to be difficult for you to learn to do. And your understanding of kind of automation is going to put you at an advantage. Like, I don't think like jobs are going to disappear overnight, but I do think tasks will. So if you think about what a job is, it's a series of interconnected tasks. And I'm sure I forgot the course, like one of the org design courses that are out there breaks down each job into tasks. So as tasks shift or change, then roles will evolve too. And if we invest in that evolution, and you're really thoughtful about how people should be spending their time and really kind of bringing value to the organization. So the real risk isn't actually like loss of jobs, it's loss of relevance. And if we don't help people shift to being relevant, that's when fear becomes reality. And that's where it's self-perpetuating. But I think that risk is probably greatest for those in the workforce now, particularly those who are kind of mid-career, people kind of in their like mid 30s to mid, kind of retirement age. Things are going to be happening quickly, and new technologies are going to be embraced. New ways of working are going to be coming quickly. So that's where like the change management aspect and really thinking through, here's how we're going to have people within our organization use it. That's where there's a real risk of where people can't use or understand how to use generative AI. You're going to be rapidly overtaken by quality of work and like the amount of work others can do as compared to you. And so you're going to fall down and to be a lower performer.
Yeah, interesting. I want to hand this over to Annie. You've been with us for a while, writing about AI work for a while. That, I think, is the most consistent through line of the questions we've been asking and writing about in this column, is that response to the fear about, am I going to lose my job? I think what Jen contributed here is really grounding, I think, in a lot of cases for people who are experiencing this. Just, it's very kind of nebulous and unfounded in a lot of cases. But I'm curious, just in the past, year or more of conversations we've had, did anything surprise you from what Jen just said, or does anything come to mind about that general conversation we've been having about is AI going to take my job?
Yeah, I think when you look into the news and you look into, the headlines, half the articles are saying, they're only going to take manual, like very autonomous potential types of tasks and jobs away, right? And then you have the people saying that it's the middlemen who are going to be taken away, the people whose decisions can be made super easily. When you look at it from like an efficiency standpoint, there's no one who needs to kind of manage people anymore if you can just automate it. And so I think it's interesting that you're looking at it from like a relevance standpoint rather than a middlemen, lowermen, uppermen, whatever terminology you'd like to use. And I think it's very optimistic that you think that for us, we have a leg up in the workplace. I think from a student perspective, I am seeing, I would especially say like lower class, not lower class, lower, yeah, lower, what are they called?
Lower classmen?
Like freshmen and sophomores.
Freshman, sophomore, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I was like, it feels weird calling them lower classmen, but they are lower classmen to me at least. The lower classmen who have, now had AI for 2 years in high school and kind of really went through their advanced courses in high school using AI and probably, getting into the senioritis of high school, just really slacking off on critical thinking and creativity. Whereas I think maybe I'm biased as a senior, but I think my grade, we had no generative AI to use for the first at least 2 to 3 years of our college career. And so now, although people are using it more, they have also written 30-page essays without the help of generative AI. And perhaps, that gives them some sort of leg up. I think a lot of freshmen and sophomores seem to be struggling when it comes to, I would say, these harder tasks. Like their first instinct is to go, to generative AI. And so perhaps that's the pessimistic view of it, I think, from a student perspective. Whereas I think, like, potentially for the new grads, the, 20-something-year-olds who are in the workforce already, they have, what generative AI doesn't have yet, which is a perfectly working brain and that knows how to critically think and decipher and discern decisions. But yeah, I think the conversation's always shifting between who's going to lose their jobs. And it's really hard for me to, I guess, confidently say, what age group or what type of job is getting lost. And I guess maybe you can talk about from either the consulting industry side of it, or maybe even with the types of industries that you've worked with as a consultant, what type of jobs you've seen or tasks are the ones that are being, the first to become automated and switched out, whether that's from, tasks point of view or like a strategic point of view. Yeah, I'd love to hear you.
Yeah. First, I'll give you an example of how I use generative AI every day. We have Microsoft Copilot. We use Teams in my organization. And what I always do is I turn on Copilot, or we generally have Copilot on calls, and I have it summarize and take notes. I like this a lot because it saves me about a half an hour every day or in every call to summarize those notes. So I conservatively save about 90 minutes to 2 hours of time that I would do taking notes, or maybe I wouldn't even get to taking notes and wouldn't send them out, and then I'd have lost productivity. Am I doing a good enough job and like pulling back that 2 hours and being like, I'm shifting it all to strategic? No, I'm probably doing a little bit more of what Ella was talking about, where I just add more tasks. So I'm actually actively trying to manage myself better to be more strategic. So that's kind of that's a real world like estimate or real world example of where I've used it. Now, where we're seeing it, and then I'll also give you an example of where I think there's kind of a responsibility expansion rather than reduction of a role, but we're seeing automation and research and summarization, basic reporting and routine customer service. So, like 80% of all customer service inquiries should be able to resolve without having to interact with a human. At next level, you need someone who's really competent, and you invest more in that person and they're kind of like a higher level of service. That's where we're really seeing things evolving, where you're kind of spending the same amount of money or you have the same number of jobs, but they're focused more on the higher level critical thinking tasks. What we think is going to be coming next is more of the mid-level analytical tasks. So not necessarily the insight, but the preparation and the structuring of the data, and maybe making sure that you're looking at the right levels of data. The stuff that like the process heavy, like kind of knowledge work is really right for us. So that's like compliance monitoring, preparing for audits, basic proposals, things like that just are kind of almost busy work, not quite busy work, but it's just overwhelming amounts of work that really gets taken. So, and what the client I'll give as an example, and was on a panel this last summer with a lot of investment firms, and what they're saying is that their kind of investment fund managers are now able to manage 10 funds instead of 3 because they have more capabilities. Where they're really worried is that their incoming, and this kind of goes to what one of the things you're worried about, their incoming people aren't getting the experience they need because now they can take these 300-page proposals, have it be ingested into their generative AI tool, and that tool can give them kind of like the basic summary information that you would have had a first-year analyst give. They really don't need those first-year analyst skills. They still need the skills of the investment manager, but now you don't have that analyst getting that experience. What are we going to do when that pool dries up? Who's going to replace that current person? That's a valid thing that we're seeing. Like in the consulting world, like we'd see, and I even hesitate to predict too much out in the future these days because so much is changing. But what we think is kind of like the first pass of an analysis, the very first thing, that kind of the basic writing, pulling together the knowledge source and being able to have that be accessed in basic things like status reports. That is all likely to be automated. Where the humans are really going to need to be in play is like building trust and relationships with clients, because clients are always going to look for, do I trust this person sitting across from me? Do I know who they are? You as a consultant, are you asking the right questions? Do you know how to ask the right questions? Do you have the experience to ask the right question? And then being able to tell stories to communicate what you want to those clients. Kind of navigating the human experience, emotion, ambiguity, resisting change, all those are still going to be into effect. And then this is something I'm working on right now, is designing the organization of the future. What are not just the processes, but what are the people systems that are out there? So I think if you look at what's going to be most important, and this gets back to what I said at the beginning about how I really liked the 3 of you having a real breadth of the majors and the thinking, is that you need people who are going to bring judgment, empathy, and being able to be provocative in a really appropriate way, not just showing up with an answer, but being a partner along the journey. And those people who aren't using just AI as a tool, but as a kind of a partner, where you're still in charge, but you have this additional capability that's going to allow you to bring even more to your client.
Something that stuck out to me with what you just said reminds me of what we talked about, like implementing or letting students use generative AI in the classroom, right? There's some classes that it's very appropriate to use. There's some, especially like entry level fundamental courses that, you probably do want your engineer to understand how Calculus 1 works, right? And, you just kind of referenced how you guys are worried about entry level employees not getting that like very busy work, manual kind of tasks to really understand how maybe status reports or whatever it is are run. Do you see some sort of compromise there? Because, at the same time, when you're starting out, you want the entry level employees to be able to work efficiently and, produce what they need to produce. At the same time, perhaps it is extremely important that they understand why, these forms are formatted the way they are and how you fill them out and how you submit them correctly for their own future. So yeah, I'd love to hear your take on that.
I think that you've hit on like the fundamental thing of what organizations are going to need to figure out. Just like I mentioned, that I think universities and colleges, educational systems are going to think, what's the outcome we want for this individual? We're going to have to think about this as well. When we have a development program at my organization, we're a technology development program, a consulting development program, a sales development program, and we're building up the skills really intentionally for those people during their progression to be able to get those skills. And I think we're going to have to be even more intentional about making sure they're getting that chance to learn. And the point is the process, the point is the journey. It's not the answer. I want someone to do that learn by doing. That's where I really think that experiential learning is so important. It sticks in your brain when you do it that way. And I think we're going to have to revisit how we're training people, or else you're going to end up with a workforce gap. It's really problematic. You're going to have a supply demand kind of talent availability issue. It's going to be very difficult to resolve at that point.
Okay, real quick, I'm going to jump in. This is a quick pause. This has been great. Thank you guys so much. I'm just going to real quick roadmap the rest of the conversation as we start to wrap up here. I want to kind of pivot and talk about the regulation. But I think there's a transition here saying, okay, we've talked all about some people's fears and, roughly, what we might do about it. But, how can we synthesize this into a big regulatory framework where we're transition there? But then I think I want to end off, and I think I'll pass this to you, Ella. Feel free to reference your research or just your own thoughts. That would be, I'm going to ask you directly, what are you optimistic about? And we can even decenter from work or whatever you want to talk about, because I don't know, we'll be hearing from you a lot as a newer writer, and I think it's just an optimistic note. And then Jen, I'll ask you the same question. What are you optimistic about? And then we'll wrap up. So
I don't know how best to bring this in, Graham, but I think one thing is like the importance of trust. Or, an example we're saying is where people will use ChatGPT during a technical interview, and it happens so fast. Basically they ask the question, and we've found that they're like typing the question to ChatGPT while they're being interviewed. And then you hire someone and you find out they actually can't do the job. And this is something we're just now saying like in the last 3 months, but we've seen it happen multiple times. So it's like that trust factor. And then the other thing that you could maybe think about is like, how do we know something is real now? And like, how do we trust art? How do we trust writing? How do we trust videos? I don't have that answer, but and then I don't know if we have time to take the conversation there, but those would be kind of two things to weave in, because I think they all play in to how this is in work. Is how do you trust who's showing up, and how do you trust that the output is real, and what do we mean by real? That could be like seminar.
Part 2.
Yeah, that'd be a whole semester of, I think that could be like a great philosophy class. I would come back to ND and audit that in a heartbeat. But how do we know what's real now?
Yeah. Okay. Let's make the last question about that. Let's sort of blend it all together and say, okay, but I do want to touch on regulation. So
regulation and to trust. I mean, getting into whether or not something's real might be too much for the rest of this, but that could be a subject you all explore in a future podcast. I would definitely tune in and listen to that.
Yeah, no, the last one we did was with our taming AI columnist. So taming is like governance and any attempts to, tame it. And we had a guy who wrote a book called A History of Fake Things on the Internet. And we talked about how evolving fake news and fake things. Yeah, rewatch that. He was great.
Yeah, I'll do that. Thanks for that tip.
For sure. Yeah, no, he was interesting. He was an interesting guy. He was kind of in his own world, but he had some good
stuff. It is. You come across all types in this like Gen AI space here. That's for sure.
Okay, I'll jump back in because I don't want to keep us all too long, but let's talk about trust. So yeah, So I think what we're hearing a lot about in this conversation is trust and transparency. It's, foundational and, fundamental to the relationships that sustain the corporate world and sustain just, a working life in general. This new variable of AI, yes, it's impacting efficiency and it's shifting tasks, but it sounds like the thing that has the greatest magnitude, perhaps the farthest to fall, would be those, relationships of trust and transparency. Jen, what do you make of that? And how do you see trust sort of evolving, in a more urgent sense? How do you make sure you're not undermining that trust day to day?
Trust is going to be defining trust, who you trust, and what you trust is just going to be, I think, the theme for sure that's kind of centers around the generative AI conversation. Can you trust the answers that you're getting? Can you trust that people know how to perform, that they know how to do their jobs? And that, can you trust that, the governments and the other, corporations are handling your data correctly and using generative AI tools correctly in their own entities? That's where the transparency comes in a lot. I'll give you an example, and then if you want to touch a little bit on kind of like formal regulation of how you can kind of manage that trust, we can go there too. We are seeing in the workforce now where people will apply for jobs, and while they're on the job, a lot of virtual interviews, they will actually be taking some of these technical interviews and talking to ChatGPT at the same time and asking the questions and getting the answers on the code. If you're going to test a computer programmer, how would you go about this activity, and ask them to tell you back, this is what I would do. This is what, this function means. This is how this piece of code would work. They're getting that answer from ChatGPT now. Then we get them in, we hire them, and then we find out they don't actually have the skills, and that they basically, use ChatGPT for the whole interview. This person doesn't have the capabilities, and I've lost trust in them as an individual. And that's not a good place to be. So how do we as an organization now, we're having to really rethink how we're evaluating people. So again, like going to what's that outcome you want, we have to rethink how we're kind of monitoring and testing that, because there's going to be an element of trust now that, okay, we can't necessarily trust that someone's not going to try to bad actor their way through this process. I think that's one thing that we're seeing clients see. And it's like you want to make sure somebody has the basic level of knowledge and skills to do a job. And now we're going to have to test it in a different way before they enter the workforce.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting outcome. Just a kind of a bizarre externality of this whole experience of learning how AI is going to impact our lives. It's, making its way into everything, even up to, job interviews and the screening process and everything.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, that's something that, not a lot of people are exposed to, but thank you for sharing that. And I
Well,
think
I hope it doesn't become a thing, but it's, people are going to be incented to try
yeah,
to get around the process or to take shortcuts. But in the long run, that stuff will come back to bite you. And
I
it
mean,
will not
especially
be
with the hiring market right now, it's
Yeah, I would say from a student perspective in computer science, everyone always says job market is cooked and it shouldn't be terminology. And I think there is a huge pressure just because you want to get the job, you will take any shortcut, possible. And you speak of the computer science or software engineering programming type of jobs that require these technical interviews. And I would say I've heard like multiple stories of students, getting jobs at Capital One, at all these, major firms through some form of cheating. Whether, I think I've heard that the interview ones are a bit more difficult or less likely for people to fully cheat on. But right now, because of the competitiveness, you have all these screenings before you even get to the in-person interview. And that's where I think people are really, going through generative AI to kind of get that. And so I wonder if there will be a shift of some sort of, an academic setting. You see lockdown browsers, you see, keep your camera on while you're doing something, they track your eye movement. Whether there will be a shift in that regard in terms of monitoring or a shift in how you evaluate candidates as a whole. But honestly, I think the latter it feels a little less likely to me just because there is such like an increase in number of applicants for practically every single job now. And so for recruiters to screen through that would be really difficult. Do you have any opinions on, I guess, that hiring process?
You brought up some really good points there. It actually made me think about how, you have testing centers where if you go in to get a certification, you do go into that closed environment. I could see something where organizations start to require people to go into this testing center to take that next level. But I don't know that identifies what you flagged as, well, how do you even get to that process? Because to be able to get there, you have to make your way through all these rounds. I don't have a good answer for that. I think that's a definite concern. It's a valid concern. And, trying to find those best candidates, again, we're going to have to rethink how we go out and find those candidates and how we identify them and how you recruit them in. I almost think that because it's so easy to apply for jobs now in bulk, and you can use bots and you can use generative AI tools to do that, companies are struggling under the weight of the number of applicants. Just, when I applied to schools, totally dating myself, but I hand wrote them. I hand wrote my Count of Monte Cristo essay for Notre Dame. It's appalling now. I look at it, I can't believe I got in. But then, I applied to 5 or 6 schools. Got the results. And I went to college. Now people are applying to 30, but it's because it's easier to do it with the compute technologies and, being able to use the internet to send your stuff in. Same thing with the jobs. You can apply to 500 jobs in a day, where before you'd have to scan the ads and you have to write it down. So we have you have a bulk problem too. And how do you cull through that without automation? I mean, that's a real challenge, but how do you flag those people who have that, kind of like trueness and have a kind of a valid moral compass? That's going to be tough to screen out. But good thing I'm a consultant. I can go and figure out this workforce future problem.
yeah. You let us know. We're happy to work with you on it too.
Oh, I'll read Ella's next column and then I'll have the answer.
For sure.
I'll
You
look
should
to,
actually throw that into ChatGPT and ask it what it would do. It'd be interesting to see.
yeah.
Hear the answers.
Okay, great. I do want to touch on regulatory, so I'll ask that
Yes.
question just because it came up at the meeting on Monday. I don't think about how to word it though. Okay. Yeah, last major thing I think we want to touch on as we wrap up here is corporate governance of artificial intelligence. there's been a lot of buzz around it. It's kind of inherited the same status that environmental social governance had a few years ago when that hit the scene. Of course, lots of strides were made there. Now, with the urgency around this new technology, this is sort of taken the spotlight. Another sort of consideration to wrap in here is that the regulatory landscape underwent a major shift. And we've written about that in the Taming AI column a few weeks ago about the pivot from Biden administration to the Trump administration, a lot more hands-off direction. So that's had, real measurable impact on companies and on everybody trying to innovate and use technology in this space. What's sort of emerged is that these corporate governance strategies of regulating AI are sort of the de facto regulation, given that there's not much coming top down from the government. A lot of it is sort of self-governance within organizations. That is a big black box for people. You run into it every once in a while. There's like a guardrail that pops up on some AI tool. You don't quite know why, or you hear stories about people in their day-to-day jobs that there's maybe a legal barrier here. There's a ceiling that you bump into when you're trying to use these tools, dealing with privacy and security, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Any insight you could give us into that kind of a black box? When has it popped up for
Yeah.
you? How do these frameworks come to be? And just sort of break
Mhm.
down that black box for us.
Again, I'll just say that this is kind of my point of view, but I actually think that the right regulations can drive innovation. And the reason is that you have a lot of organizations who are hesitant to use AI, generative AI, and to bring it into their organizations and to use it at scale because they're worried about what could happen
Mhm.
and that nobody really seems to know. And what if they go down this path and do too much? So they freeze and they don't take advantage of basic things. Whereas if there were kind of real common guardrails in place and people knew what the rules were and they knew what was kind of safe or what would be okay to use, kind of the table stakes, they'd be more likely to being able to take advantage of some of these benefits and to start using it. And it would see the commensurate innovation. So I think that, conversely, sometimes a lack of regulation can create that environment where people really hold back because of fear and lack of understanding. Now, too much regulation where we're seeing really like don't use any generative AI at all, or the worst is like no artificial intelligence when you've been like using artificial intelligence at scale for 15 years. You're like, if you want us to pull all AI out, we actually have to roll back to COBOL. I mean, that's like sometimes you see policymakers just not understanding, talking about, and so they can overregulate. And what we're seeing in some states is where governments will say no generative AI can be used without this exception. You increase the bureaucracy and it makes it just impossible to get anything done. That doesn't hold the bad actors back from progressing. Like, what if you have some of these other kind of entities out there really being able to use generative AI better and faster and more efficiently than our kind of corporations or governments? That's a problem too. So I think there's a middle ground where you can give some guidance and regulations over here's how we're going to use AI responsibly. Here are the guardrails that organizations should have in place and have kind of a common understanding of that. I think that would pull some of the fear of this technology out of the market and create that environment where people are going to continue to feel comfortable using it and then be comfortable seeing that innovation continue to unfold.
Yeah, that's a great answer. It makes total sense. And again, it's not something a ton of people have exposure to, so it's important to
I'll give you one more example, Graham. And this is like we do a lot of presentations to state leaders, state agencies, to the legislatures, and we'll ask them kind of on a continuum, who uses generative AI every day, who's familiar with it, who wants to embrace it, and who thinks it's like the worst thing ever, that it's going to destroy humanity. And more often you see the people making the regulations kind of saying, I don't have a working knowledge of generative AI. I don't really understand it. And they're over here on the continuum closer to don't use it. And so I think it's really important that our legislators and those making the laws, those really kind of creating the policy, understand what this technology is, what it means, how to use it, and then to make the regulations with that in mind. Because I think there is a real risk of kind of shutting things down too much as there's a risk of doing nothing. And that will hold people back because they don't know what's safe and what's not.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And just to kind of start to put a bow on this conversation, I want to pass things back over to our writers and just talk a little bit about the optimistic side of things. What are you excited about? And that you can feel free to decenter this from, work or school or the corporate world. What gets you excited from a researcher just in general about the direction that, AI is taking your life and society?
I think something that's really exciting about it is that, like you mentioned before, it's an inflection point, and inflection points, don't necessarily, or honestly, always or ever turn into a direction of, now the entire world's going to crash and burn, robots going to take over. I remember listening to some other podcasts where they asked Hans Zimmer, the soundtrack creator for Interstellar and all these amazing movies, how he feels about AI and his music and how it's used for art and whether or not that's going to decrease people's creativity, it's going to take people's jobs, etc. And he was extremely optimistic. And so I'm kind of taking his point, I guess, in the sense that it forces everybody to kind of shift into a new way of thinking, into a new way of innovation that, I think that hasn't challenged us for a bit. And I think in order for these progresses to continue happening, like in some way, it's really good that something, so stark and so dramatic hit us super quick, because I think with the right regulations, like we just talked about, with the right people and the right minds, that it's definitely in 30 years, we're gonna look back and be like, this was a good thing. And so I have a very optimistic point of view on that, at least. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, Ella.
Yeah, so I was just going to say a couple weeks ago, I was sitting in one of my CS professor's offices. We were having this entire conversation about sort of the use of AI and how it's affecting particularly computer science students, but students in general. And I think what's scary is sort of what we've been talking about, how it can like sort of allow students to get by without actually understanding. But I think that the more important sort of approach, or the more optimistic one to take, is that it allows students who have that drive to learn, and those who, want to be better computer scientists, it gives them a means to do that continuously and constantly. So you have this tool that sort of allows you to always, interact, ask questions, understand what's going on. You can ask it questions all night and it never gets tired. So I think it really comes down to the type of person you're dealing with. And if that person has that drive to learn and wants to succeed and excel in whatever field they go into, they'll be able to use AI to aid their sort of growth and development, as opposed to using it as a crutch or as something that allows them to get by without actually knowing anything. Because what's the fun in that? You go to school to be educated and to learn how to do these things. And I think it would be silly for someone to, use AI in a way that doesn't build that up, but instead tears that down. Yeah.
I think you both have, I think those points of view are both spot on. And that one is that, that we can use this for good, and this can be something that ultimately, benefits society. I mean, you think about the applications of it, just even in the medical field, where you're going to be able to maybe identify, and I know Notre Dame has a Center for Rare Diseases. Imagine if people all around the world had immediate access to that kind of capability, that corpus of knowledge, so that they could identify some of these things sooner and get treatments faster. I mean, that kind of thing, the ability to affect a better, positive quality of life is, I think, really a strong possibility. And I think, Ella, the point that you made about, the students, like, you're only hurting yourself if you don't take the courses. In the long run, if you don't choose to learn, I kind of think about, man, if you just put the effort you're putting into trying to cheat into learning, you're going to be in the same place, a much more moral location as well. There's always going to be dangers, and there's always going to be the challenges of technology. Part of me wonders if we're going to end up in the Wall-E world. If you watch all those Pixar movies, and we're going to be sitting there in those big things, like watching our Coca-Cola change, or if you haven't seen the movie Idiocracy, I mean, that's a possibility too. But also, the things that humans have been good at for eons is change and adaptation. And we've seen it in the changing of jobs and how people live and how people interact. And if you come back to kind of the core always of what makes us human, and we kind of collectively as a society agree to keep that at its core, I think that's where the technologies will continue to enhance us and to allow us to ultimately have better quality of life, better interactions with people, and generally raise up the standard of living for all.
Yeah. Thank you all for those, parting thoughts. And Jen, thank you so much for being here.
It's so great to see you all. Thank you so much for the time, and go Irish.
Go Irish.
Go
You're
Irish.
Irish. Last thing I'll say is a quick plug of the AI at Work column written by Annie and Ella here. Check it out. It's a great living document of the exploration of how AI is going to be impacting our working world, labor, commerce, the whole gambit. Again, thank you all for being here, and that's it from us.